Hi, Danilyn.
Hi, Derval. How are you doing?
I am excited.
I am.
Welcome.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Not just because it's a Friday, but I've been energized coming off a very electrifying day one of the Caribbean Women for Climate Justice Conference 2025. I mean, it was amazing. What did you think about yesterday?
It truly was amazing as we explored the dimensions of resilience. I was so in awe of the work that Caribbean women and also Ivy out of Kenya, the
Yeah.
work that they are doing to really support resilience, really support sustainable development, and really to boost gender equity.
You are so right. And I love the fact that everyone really aligned with the theme, sowing seeds of sustainable solutions. We spoke about the fact that we didn't want this conference to just air the problems because we know already. And everyone really came with such insightful experiences. And people talk about lived experiences being cliche, but it isn't. And I love the fact that it is through the lived experiences of people that we are honing expertise in addressing these problems and exploring solutions. And I really want to shout out the audience yesterday. Did you realize that the chat was firing on all cylinders? People were engaged. The information that came from all the speakers were so I already said enriching, but really well received and exactly what we want because we want to build a community for practical solutions and that everyone who is, whether they're listening live or will be hearing this through some other medium, they'll be getting examples that they can apply in their respective contexts. And that was really what we wanted. And we're grateful to have that happen here at CW4CJ.
Yes, so welcome back. If you were here yesterday, let us know in the chat if you were here for day one. Just comment day one. And if you're joining us for the first time for CW4CJ 2025, welcome. We're so glad to have you. You are a big part of this because we need the engagement, and it's all about building awareness and also sharing knowledge as we seek to develop, robust solutions that will create a more equitable and inclusive and climate resilient Caribbean and beyond. So I'm seeing a couple of day ones in the chat. So glad that you're back. Let us know what your thoughts were on day one on this session and any key insights. One of the things that really stood out to me, I mean, all of the presenters were, solid, powerful, and impactful. But something that kept resonating is Nicole Joseph Chin speaking about protecting women's dignity and security in the midst of a disaster, and some
Yeah,
of the things that we take for granted, until we find ourselves, God forbid, in those situations.
yeah,
What
yeah.
stood out for you, Danilyn?
I was going to say the same thing. Before I say that, Durval, I was distracted by the fact that Ivy, our speaker from yesterday, all the way from Kenya, has joined us. So, welcome back, Ivy, who is, and I think Ivy has insomnia. She doesn't sleep because I know it's 4 minutes after 1 a.m., 1:04 a.m. in Kenya. So, Ivy, thank you again for joining us. And so, let me just start with that, Durval, to have the global south context. So, Ivy would have shared about participatory communication and how we can use that in application of for women in production systems, and she spoke about women in Kenyan coffee, and I've had Kenyan coffee; it's really good. And so we love that insight because I'm gonna link it with something that Nicole had said as well. To say the fact that some of us were experiencing the same issues and impacts. It is like the thread that links us together is really why we should be collaborating. And so we see the kind of alignment with the global south perspective, not just through the challenge, but the same thing that we are trying to do here is the shared solidarity and action and the information exchange. I think I want to echo with you as well in terms of Nicole's intervention, similar to what also Dr. Henry has been doing in Haiti in terms of recovery. We tend to, I don't want to, we tend to always look at the technical ways in which we are responding, building resilience, whether it's infrastructure, whether it's looking at the sector level approaches and so on. But what we have done yesterday was to underscore the invisible elements that we need to consider, the burden of care and care work and what it feels. And all of us in this room, when we are not 100%, we can't function properly. And so there are certain, I don't want to say insecurities, but there are certain things that we're deprived of as women. And so even in vulnerable communities, it's even intensified. And so I think, Nicole's presentation really underscored that there are some things that we need to think of even before we get to certain boardroom matters as to how we're driving change and transformation. These that we have to go back to the basics of care and consideration and dignity. Very important, and that's even an intersectional word because it also comes over to the International Office for Migration's presentation when we think about climate and forced displacement, and forced climate-induced migration. And so we were really happy to have these insights, and also happy that if you didn't catch it live, we will have those tidbits ready for you, and we'll share more. So make sure that you're tuned into the Global Yaadie and the Climate Conscious platforms, because of course we're going to be sharing highlights from each of the 3 days from CW4CJ 2025.
Yes. And then, Ellen, yesterday we set out to really explore the dimensions of resilience. And I dare say, mission accomplished by our very
Can say it with our chest.
stellar panel. And today we're back to explore something that is equally important, looking at women in leadership and how they navigate those different spaces, as you would see from our panel, as well as our keynote, who will give us some, real insights on disaster resilience in the Caribbean. And I'm really looking forward to the keynote as she brings both that academic research as well as lived experience as a resident of the Bahamas and experiencing Hurricane Dorian. So I know she's going to bring something really insightful, impactful for us.
Absolutely. I am looking forward to that as well. So before we transition to our keynote, I also want to acknowledge the community that made this possible. Want to thank our sponsors, Girls Care. Want to thank our donors, Carolina Foundation, for making this possible, and of course the community co-sponsors who have been doing excellent work in amplifying awareness of CW4CJ, and of course, all our speakers who made it possible yesterday that we can say it was a success already. We have to put positivity out in the atmosphere. We want to say thank you for doing what you have done in making this edition of CW4CJ possible for everyone.
Yes, indeed. And we must thank our audience for showing up and engaging, not only today, but also on social media throughout the campaign. We've put out some really good content to engage on the topic of the intersection of climate justice and gender justice in the Caribbean and the wider global south. So we're really grateful to our community, our donor, our sponsors, our community co-sponsors, as you said. And of course, I'm grateful to you, Dana Lynn. I can't stop saying it. This collab was a long time in coming.
Yes,
And and here we are. And I'm really proud of what we have been able to produce. So
amen to that.
I'm ready to get into it. Are
Yes,
you?
I am so ready. All right. So, the most anticipated, or one of the most anticipated elements of today, is our keynote address. And it is my pleasure to introduce the keynote speaker, Kendra Ferguson. She is a sustainability and climate resilience specialist with over a decade of experience across the Caribbean. Kendra holds a master's in global sustainability and is completing her PhD in sustainable development at the University of the West Indies. Her work spans disaster risk reduction, renewable energy, environmental management, and sustainable tourism, supporting governments, international agencies, and NGOs on policy development, project implementation, and capacity building. Hailing from the Bahamas, and also on the scoring for today, Power in Her Hands, let us give a warm welcome to Kendria Ferguson.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh my gosh, what a welcome. I need to hire you guys for everywhere I go. Good evening, everyone, and thank you so much to the Climate Conscious Podcast, the Global Yaadie, and the Clara Lionel Foundation, and all our wonderful sponsors for this opportunity. As I mentioned, I'm from the beautiful islands of the Bahamas, and I'm certainly honored to be your keynote speaker for day two of the Caribbean Women for Climate Justice virtual conference. A bit about my research with the University of West Indies. I focus on social vulnerability at the household and community levels. But tonight, I want to highlight the invisible labor, the quiet leadership, and the powerful resilience of our Caribbean women in the face of what we are experiencing climate chaos. And more importantly, how do we take that power and institutionalize it and really help strengthen our community resilience? So let's get started. So I really wanted to start and zoom in on what's been happening in our region from 2015 to 2024. And this shows a hurricane tracks of every single hurricane that have been recorded for our region during that period. More particularly for me in the Bahamas, between 2015 and 2019, we had four major hurricanes. We had Hurricane Joaquin, which was a Category 4, Hurricane Matthew, which was also a Category 4, Hurricane Irma, and Hurricane Dorian, both Category 5 storms. Each line on this map certainly represents the storm's journey that has cut through the Eastern Caribbean, and sometimes it has slammed islands, the same islands and the same communities more than once. Most recently, the region is very familiar with what happened with Hurricane Beryl, which caused mass destruction for our brothers and sisters in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Jamaica, and Grenada. And so for us, the question right now is not if another storm will happen, but when and who will be the most affected. So looking at this, it always is a reminder that these storms don't impact communities equally. This is where gender, poverty, and marginalization begin to shape vulnerability and recovery outcomes for the region. So, taking a moment, I want to begin to unpack why gender is such a critical factor in disaster response across the Caribbean. Let's start with what we saw in the Bahamas after Hurricane Dorian. In my research, I found that female headed households in Abaco and Grand Bahama, two islands in our northern Bahamas that were most impacted by the storm, these households more likely reported displacement after the storm. They also lacked house insurance and also financial buffers to support recovery prior to Hurricane Dorian making an impact on those islands. These gaps certainly delay their ability to rebuild and restabilize their lives after the storm. But this story is certainly not unique to the Bahamas. Across the region, we are seeing women are leading the response at the household level. In St. Vincent and the Grenadines, for example, we saw that female farmers and vendors using savings and social networks to help their families survive after volcanic and storm-related shocks. These grassroots resilience strategies are often led by women, and they really help propel communities towards long-term recovery. At the same time, we see women in unpaid caregiving responsibilities, and these tend to intensify after a hurricane or a disaster event. So, women not only caring for their children, but they also care for the elderly, the sick, and often displaced neighbors and extended family. This caregiving work we know is essential to our community makeup, but it also limits women's ability to relocate, to find employment, and even access assistance programs after a disaster event. So this is where we see a lot of structural problems, right? Because social protection systems often overlook women's role in informal labor and caregiving. This means that when women are doing the most to keep families and communities afloat, they are often least supported by any disaster or national policy. So for me, this slide is certainly a reminder that gender matters not only how it shapes risk, but it certainly shapes how people recover. It shapes who gets left behind after disaster and also who ends up holding everything together during crisis. So, if we are to continue to explore the invisible layers of gendered vulnerability and how often these go unaddressed in disaster planning, let's first look at employment. Across the Caribbean, women are heavily concentrated in vulnerable sectors: tourism, healthcare, education, caregiving, beauty related sectors. These sectors are most likely disrupted or shut down during or after hurricane events or other forms of disasters. After Hurricane Dorian, many women in Abaco and Grand Bahama, they lost their job within the hospitality sector. They also lost access to early childhood care and informal retail and food sectors. They also lost their jobs there as well. These sectors tend to have rapid layoffs and prolonged closures. But what is unique with Hurricane Dorian is that these sectors was then impacted again because COVID-19 started just after the storm. So that meant that it halted tourism recovery, it halted and slowed down recovery on the ground for the disasters. So many of these households, and mostly female headed households, went without stable income for a much prolonged period than usual. And because of this, many women were unable to rebuild their lives in a swift manner. Even today, almost 5 years after the storm, many households are still rebuilding. And this pattern, again, is not unique to the Bahamas. In Suriname, St. Lucia, and Barbados, we often see that women bear the emotional burden of recovery, right? So we deal with the stress, we deal with the grief, we deal with the labor, and all of this goes unaccounted for and unsupported within our national formal systems. And this is certainly why gender matters in disaster response. It is not just about who house get hit anymore, what public service is no longer available, but it's about whose recovery is going to be delayed and whose trauma is invisible. We have not even touched on the mental health status of women throughout these periods because that's always not even a thought for people, right? We're just told to be strong, resilient, and to deal with it. And then we forget to really consider what this labor costs for women. That is often taken for granted in these situations across the region. So, across the Caribbean, when disaster strikes, women consistently emerge as the backbone of community recovery, not through formal appointments or positions, but through necessity. In true form, this is seriously who we are as a people. We have a natural instinct to be deeply rooted within our communities. We take on the emotional weight of caregiving. We manage food distribution sites. We ensure shelters have what they need. We get children into some sort of routine. And even if schools are closed or supplies are limited, we always find a way to make our family and our kids and our communities feel safe and love during these times. So women, they support our vulnerable neighbors. We mobilize our networks. We fill these institutional gaps that are often invisible to our government systems. And this is certainly not random, but it definitely reflects the qualities of women throughout the region. We have empathy. We help others use and recognize and respond to human needs. We have great organizational skills, and we have trusted social networks that we have built throughout our communities. And so, because of this, our resilience has been shaped by long term exposure to economic strain, environmental risks, and social responsibilities. And unfortunately, these strengths are not translated into international policies. We're not having a seat at the table for decision making processes. And because of that, we are not just simply first responders. We are holding our communities together in ways more than anybody can really think of. And yet, when women lead these food drives and we coordinate shelters and we build mutual aid systems, our labor is often labeled as volunteering, right? So we rarely are compensated, we're never consulted, and we're often left out of these decision making spaces. So if we are truly focused on building resilient systems, we must first begin to recognize that this type of labor, resourcing it and bringing these women leaders to the table after a crisis is not just a need, right? It's a necessity at this point. We must do this in order to rebuild our communities and rebuild a level of resilience that can transcend year after year. So I want to pause here. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, so I missed a slide. So just go back. Okay, so I want to take a moment here to really look at some strategies that have been put on the table for the region, right? So in Jamaica, there is a strong foundation of women led agro processing groups. These networks could be activated in future disaster response to produce an emergency ready meals for shelters and vulnerable households. This will not only formalize what is already being done, but it certainly recognized this group of ladies and this role that they have in food security and logistics planning. In Suriname, we see that there's a need to train women in early warning, community based risk mapping, as well as preparedness planning to really help shape their community response. We know that equipping women to lead drills and assessing vulnerabilities can really help strengthen community trust, but also it expands national systems. When we look at the island of Barbados, right, we see women entrepreneurs are extremely active in agriculture and small business. So, targeting support through climate resilience, agroforestry, ensuring financial literacy is available to them. Disaster risk education is also a must. Focusing on those elements can really help shape recovery and really move the islands from being reactive to proactive. We've seen across the board that empowering women certainly build adaptive systems, right? So why aren't we doing more with that? Why aren't we building on this amazing tool that we have already existing in our community? So I wanted to pause here and I really want to sit for a moment to really look at the fact that women don't didn't just grow food, they design emergency food systems. And that is the value that sits in Jamaica's disaster response strategy and recommendations. Um, we can do so much more if we brought women to the table. These women are not only feeding their families or working on farms, they are actively designing response system, providing nutrition, managing logistic networks, ensuring safety in much ways that are faster than other formal responsive, but they have the community trust that is certainly needed during disaster response periods. And so I really want that to push us to ask, what disaster resilience will look like if we centered solutions around women and around programs that already exist. And really take a moment to think about what programs exist in your country and your community that can really serve a benefit in the different stages of disasters. We've become such a reactive community that we're not thinking about preparedness. We're not thinking about early warning systems, and really think about how your community can really shape and build those by using existing structures that are already beneficial to your community. So much of what I mentioned so far about how gender shapes risk, recovery, and women leadership was reflected in my own PhD research on Hurricane Dorian impacts in Abaco and Grand Bahama. And although my study has been broadly focused on household level socioeconomic vulnerability, gendered patterns certainly emerge organically throughout. And so I pulled some of that data to share tonight. Um, and I really wanted to point out that, again, female headed households and the dynamics and the change in family structure is a major issue and a major concern that has expanded beyond social ills and is certainly being impacted by disasters that we are not having conversations about. So hopefully that is a conversation that we can have regionally in the near future. But to begin with, I found that a significant portion of displaced households were led by women in Abaco and Grand Bahama, many of whom had no property ownership, and they also had limited access to savings accounts prior to the storm that can help build a safety net for them after the storm. What made this finding pretty worse is that a large number of these households were renters. And so after the storm, many of these landlords either abandoned their properties or they chose not to rebuild immediately. And without any legal obligation to repair, we found that many women and children were left without housing and often indefinitely. And as you may know, after a hurricane, the cost of everything goes up. So renting costs has certainly skyrocketed on those islands, especially Abaco. And so now we find ourselves in a position where there is a major housing issue for those islands and for families who are just simply trying to rebuild their lives. Economically, the story is just as stark. Women were concentrated in sectors: education, caregiving, tourism, and from a tourism perspective, that was food and beverage, that was housekeeping, and front desk related type roles, as well as informal retail. These jobs were one of the first to disappear, and businesses laid off staff pretty rapidly after the storm. And in many cases, they remained closed for extended periods. And like I mentioned before, they were further impacted by COVID-19. So we found that a lot of women and their children relocated to other Bahamian islands, more so Nassau, and they stayed with extended families. Many of them had to switch careers because it was difficult to go right back into their career that they had before. And they basically had to find jobs and start all over in Nassau. At home, I also found that emotional and logistic work of recovery fell mostly on women. They had to organize temporary shelter. So, like I mentioned, evacuating or even using a public shelter. They supported their children's trauma recovery. They managed emergency needs at the time, whether it was seeking out healthcare, medication, that sort of thing. They were also the main ones that were seeking out assistance and supporting and support at distribution centers. So throughout my research, I often heard that most people that came into distribution centers for food or clothing or even food vouchers were women more so than the actual men of the family. These women were also responsible for navigating schooling, so re-engaging their kids into schools, whether it's on a different island, whether it's a different school within the community. They were responsible for figuring that out and doing all of this without limited support from structured national services. And these efforts, though they go unnoticed, were certainly critical for household survival. They remained invisible in official recovery frameworks, and to this day, they've not really been incorporated within disaster response strategies. But despite all of this is happening, Bahamian women, they continue to endure. And they certainly have led disaster response after Hurricane Dorian. I've witnessed personally women-led organizations taking the front seat to disaster response. They expanded community-based initiatives. Some of them created NGOs, particularly out of the need for recovery. And all of this just to fill the gaps of national response that was happening. For example, Bahamas Strong, which was led by a group of brilliant women throughout the private sector, they stepped in and coordinated evacuation logistics. They coordinated short-term housing. They provided access to immediate food at evacuation centers. They coordinated medication and healthcare. And they also supported restoring family connections. As evacuations happen and recovery needs change, they facilitated multi-island aid distribution across multiple Bahamian islands, including Eleuthera, as well as within Nassau. Additionally, existing NGOs like Lend a Hand Bahamas and Equality Bahamas, all of which are led by women teams, they pivoted their community response plans to meet the needs of displaced families within their communities. So if how people were relocating to Nassau, they changed their programming to ensure that these families had access to food, to shelter, and services within their communities to help them rebuild their lives. But even as women-led response at the ground level, they still remain largely absent from decision-making tables within the country. Their leadership has been powerful, but it's still been unfunded. And unfortunately, a lot of this work was being heavily criticized by governments while it was actually happening. And that was mostly because these organizations and women-led groups, they acted faster. They had less bureaucratic processes, and they gained the attention of a lot of international audiences and organizations. So they got access to funding fairly quickly to support their movement. And so the dynamics surrounding Hurricane Dorian certainly affirms what we're seeing across the region. And that is Caribbean women are not just experiencing disasters, they're navigating it, they're sustaining, and they're reshaping how we do recovery. And unless our policies evolve to reflect that reality, we certainly risk designing systems that fail to support the very people that are holding it together. So I spoke a bit about the gaps, and we've seen some solutions. And first, I really want to look at what would a gender just resilience framework look like. And first, it certainly starts with representation, right? So women aren't just affected by disasters; we're leading on the ground. So we must be part of formal decision-making processes, from shelter design to evacuation planning to how climate funds are being distributed. Secondly, we need gender responsive early warning systems and preparedness plans. And what that really means is that recognizing a one size fit all approach would not work. Women are caring for children, elderly, we're living in informal housing. We need tailored communication. We need shelter options that allows for protection of women and children. And we need access to resources. And third, we definitely must support inclusive livelihoods and social protection. Like I mentioned, women are in vulnerable sectors, right? We are caregiving, we're in farming, we are the ladies in the tourist craft markets, we are beauty services, right? And we're often excluded from aid and recovery programming. And so that's mainly because we're outside of the formal labor force. And so now we must really move to make those labor force programming and social protections much more inclusive. And lastly, we must certainly strengthen our data, funding, and accountability. Um, One of the biggest challenges that I've encountered is that we don't have social data in the Bahamas, and we don't have timely social data in the Bahamas. And that's certainly a challenge throughout the region. So if we're not collecting gender-based data, so how do we know who's left behind? How do we know how many single female households do we have? How do we know what challenges they're facing? And so if we're not funding women-led solutions, how can we scale what is already working within our community? And I hope this doesn't just come off as a list, but rather certainly a strategy and a starting point, because now more than ever, what we're seeing that's happening in the United States and across the world, the Caribbean in itself must truly come together and be much more inclusive and resilient within ourselves. And so I wanted to, before I end, I really wanted to leave you with a call to action. We talked about gender risk, we talked about unpaid labor, we talked about grassroots leadership. I want to leave you with 5 actions that can really help us sow these seeds of sustainable solutions. So first one, we must fund women-led solutions. These organizations already exist. They're already responding. They know their communities better than anybody. So what we need is consistent direct funding, and not just pilot projects, but we need sustained long-term community-driven action. Secondly, we need to integrate gender into policy and finance. Every risk assessment, every national debate, every national budget, every climate strategy and developmental proposal should ask, how does it affect women? And who is at the table having these conversations, making these decisions, and putting these policies and strategies in place? Third, we must institutionalize local leadership. We must create clear mechanisms for women community leaders to participate in national and regional disaster planning. And I'm not meaning just through consultations. We need them at the very beginning, involved in formal decision making roles as well as planning. And fourth, we must design inclusive protection systems. Early warning, evacuation routes, shelters must be safe and accessible for women, as well as for children and the elderly. We must ensure that these temporary safe spots are available to everybody and accessible to everybody. And it provides an opportunity for people to just breathe and just to be able to realize that they will be okay. And this is just the start of a rebuilding process. And finally, we must shift from recognition to redistribution. It is not enough to say that Caribbean women are resilient and strong, and sometimes using those words I find to be very offensive, because we don't want to be strong all the time. We just want to feel safe. But we must give our women the tools, the access to funding, and the authority to lead within their communities, because they're already doing it. So let's put more emphasis behind our women. Let's fight more for our women. Let's speak up more for our women. And let's really help reshape how we respond, prepare, and recover from disasters by integrating women in through all aspects of our disaster cycle. The future of climate justice in the Caribbean depends certainly deeply on how we root systems and experiences in the leadership of our Caribbean women. And that is it for me tonight. But I certainly want to leave this quote with you guys. Caribbean women, we are not just survivors of disasters, we are certainly the architects of resilience. And so, thank you guys so much. I hope this was very informative for everybody. Please connect with me on LinkedIn. And thank you to the entire Climate Conscious podcast and the Yaadie for inviting me to be your keynote tonight. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Kendria, for such a powerful presentation, helping us all to rethink and reshape disaster resilience and how we respond to it, given that we are essentially in the era of climate change, and we can expect, the impacts to continue unfolding. But instead of just sitting in a space of vulnerability and even victimhood, women are already leading in resilience, and we just need the opportunities. We just need all the policymakers and decision makers to implement all of your recommendations that you shared with us here today. So thank you so much for sharing your insights and being part of our community. Over
Thank
to
you
you,
so much.
the global Yadi.
Okay, thank you, Derval, and thank you, Kendra, as well, for such an insightful keynote, as we anticipated, of course. And now we are switching tempo because we are heading over into our panel discussion. Power in Her Hands, Cultivating Equity and Climate Solutions in the Global South. And I am going to change hands, or hand over to another co pilot. I want to introduce our moderator for this evening, Marianne Oseo. She is a storyteller and advisor working at the intersection of nature, culture, and human flourishing. Her work supports inner and social transformation approaches to earth care with the aim of helping humanity reconcile our relationship with Mother Earth. She is the founder and host of Black Earth, an award winning podcast and community exploring how Black women are restoring ecosystems, communities, and harmonious ways of being in relationship with the rest of nature. She has previously worked with organizations including WWF, the World Wildlife Fund, the UNHCR Innovation Service, establishing and contributing to innovative programs for earth care. At WWF, she established and led a global community of practice for socially equitable nature conservation and commissioned novel research mapping community conservation programs addressing social inequality in the UK. Marion is currently a Storytelling for Social Change Fellow at the University of Arts of London and a board member of the Global Green Grants Fund UK. She is inspired by and dedicated to Mother Earth. Please, everyone, let us welcome our moderator, Marion.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome and for my bio. I'm so grateful that you managed to read all of that. Hi, everybody. My name is Marion. I am so excited and so energized for our panel discussion today, especially after Kendria's incredible presentation. There's so much to take away from that, and definitely there will be some cross-referencing with our panelists today. I think one of the audience members joining us today said that our government leaders need to see this presentation, and I definitely agree. And also our communities, right? This is a space for us to share knowledge, to share learning amongst each other and across the whole region. So thank you so much, Kendria, and you have paved the way for a dynamic discussion with our panelists today. Before we start our discussion, I'd like to briefly introduce the four panelists who will be joining us today. Our first panelist is Renee Atwell. Renee is an attorney at law and founder of Girls of Impact, focusing on youth empowerment, gender equity, and sustainable development across Trinidad and Tobago and the wider Caribbean. Welcome, Renee.
Thank you
Our,
so much for having me.
you're most welcome. Our second panelist is Dr. Teresa Rodriguez Moody, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Jamaica Environment Trust, where she leads advocacy for environmental justice, transparency, and public engagement in Jamaica. Welcome, Dr. Teresa.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Our third panelist is Jacinta Rayalin, who is a youth leader and cultural advocate from Guyana's Wapishan territory. Jacinta works at the intersection of Indigenous rights, environmental stewardship, and community media. Welcome, Jacinta.
Hi, thank
And
you.
you're most welcome. And our fourth panelist is Steffi Hira, who is the Chief Customer Officer at Renewable Power Caribbean Limited, driving sustainable energy solutions through public education, social investment, and inclusive capacity building. Welcome, Steffi.
Hi, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you here. Um, so we'll get straight into it. My first question is to you, Jacinta. How do women navigate leadership in Indigenous communities, and what can other communities learn from the way that they lead?
All right. Thank you. And we all know that women play important role in today's society. And as we refer to Indigenous women, an Indigenous youth from an Indigenous community, and how we navigate leadership within our Indigenous communities. In most cases, we might not find women in the formal political structures. For example, as a tushao within our village. But women are often the behind scenes with the male leaders. They are the ones who also support the leaders, guide them when it comes to decision making. They also have they also navigate leadership by having the central. They are the central to household economies. They do farming, subsistence farming, the fish, they do craft production, and they often lead efforts to help them with their livelihoods, more explore economic opportunities, for example, with the ecotourism. And while they are connected, deeply connected to traditions, Indigenous women are now stepping up into formal leadership roles, participating in village councils, representing their communities at local, regional levels. And this is being supported by the local groups within the communities to help women take up leadership roles or take up the mantle of being leaders within these communities. They also help to navigate this space by often bringing their tradition, their knowledge to bear on issues like land rights, resource management, and even climate change. Indigenous women are now increasingly advocating for their land rights, their rights to their communities, and the protection of their land, resource, and territories. They have now taken up the opportunity to engage with NGOs, governmental agencies, to raise awareness and demand action to the issues that are affecting their communities. And what other communities or what communities can learn is that Indigenous women leadership often prioritizes the well-being of an entire community and not for self-gain. So women play an important role in leadership. They look at things different way than men. They more look at a community or a communal or a group than focus on themselves. So oftentimes other communities can learn to foster to foster deeply connected into their communities to make decisions. They can also learn with the passing down of the knowledge and skills across generations, which is an important role Indigenous women play in our communities. Uh, Another thing that other communities can learn is that they can recognize and support women vital contributions to community leadership, particularly in things like food security, health, environmental stewardship, which can lead to effective outcome in a community. So by observing and supporting Indigenous women or the leadership of Indigenous women across communities or across the country, other communities can gain insight to creating more resilient, culturally related approaches to governance and development of our community.
Thank you so much, Jacinta. Um, Renee, I would love to speak to you about Girls of Impact and the work that you do there. And specifically, I'm curious to understand, um, how mentorship and leadership development has transformed the lives of young women that you work with and the impacts of that in their communities.
Thank you so much, Marianne, for that question. Well, Girls of Impact is an organization that I would have founded in 2022, really and truly to center on the aspect of mentorship and leadership training for young women, acknowledging, of course, that there are lots of young women within the region that want to achieve certain personal and professional goals and they lack that guidance and someone to steer them through that path, but also due to the lack of women in decision making spaces. And so through our programs we are able to provide mentorship as well as leadership training, really to prepare young women for leadership positions and for professional and entrepreneurial opportunities within their various spheres and communities. And a lot of what we do at Girls of Impact, we try to ensure it's very research focused because we have a lot of reports and research coming out of the Caribbean region acknowledging the importance of mentorship. For example, there was a report that was done in 2022 by UN Women and the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction that focused on gender equality and women leadership for resilience to disaster risks in Latin America and the Caribbean. And one of the things that this report highlighted was mentorship being a key tool to unlocking the leadership potential for Caribbean girls and women. And of course, this particular report zoomed in on disaster risk reduction settings. But the findings of this report could really be used in many other industries, particularly as we strive to achieve sustainable development in the Caribbean, acknowledging that mentorship and leadership training has serious and far-reaching benefits for the Caribbean region. We're looking at things like improved confidence for young women, ensuring that they have role models and representations in various fields, and ensuring that they are able to build the skills and networks that they need to go on to assume leadership positions in their various communities. So some of the things that we have seen in terms of how mentorship and leadership training has transformed the lives of young women, we've seen increasing confidence, them being able to master their skills, which have equipped them to be able to go on to apply for opportunities in personal and professional spaces. And we've also seen a development of their leadership skills, which makes them better positioned to contribute in terms of more women in leadership, as well as actually having the skills needed to lead, whether that be in school, at work, or in their community, as well as an increase in workplace readiness, especially for those who work in more traditionally male-dominated sectors, areas such as law and engineering, etc. I have a personal anecdote coming out of one of our programs. We had a young woman enter into one of our mentorship programs in 2024. And at the time that she entered into the program, she lacked guidance and insight in terms of how she wanted her career to really span out. She had done her degree in geology. And at the time, she didn't have any offers, any opportunities. But after going through the program and, of course, pairing her with a mentor in the field of environmental sustainability, she was able to go on to secure a position as a junior geologist at the UA Seismic Research Center. So we go on and we can really see how when we are able to provide young women with mentorship and with leadership training, they are able to go on, assume positions, particularly where environmental sustainability and sustainability sustainable development is concerned to really move the region forward. Because as you know, coming off the heels of our keynote presentation, we are seeing that, of course, women are needed in these decision-making spaces. And when we are able to give them the mentorship and training, they will go on to do that so that we can make better and more sustainable decisions for the Caribbean region.
That's powerful. Thank you so much, Renee. I wanted to connect that you mentioned that mentorship is especially powerful in sectors where there are fewer women in leadership positions. And Steffi, I want to speak to you about the experiences of women navigating leadership in the sustainable energy sector. What does that look like, and how can their engagement be expanded at every level?
Right. Good afternoon again, everyone. So, from my experience and that of many incredible women that I've worked alongside, we navigate leadership in this sector by blending our technical expertise with deeply collaborative approaches, all fueled by an unwavering commitment to sustainable development. So, we as women often bring unique perspective to the table, fostering inclusive decision making, championing community-led initiatives, and ensuring that social equity is at the heart of our climate solutions. Now, our leadership is frequently characterized by resilience, innovative problem solving, and a holistic understanding of how energy access, gender equality, and climate resilience are interconnected. Now, let's be honest, the path isn't always smooth. We as women frequently encounter systemic barriers, unconscious bias, limited access to crucial funding and networks, and a noticeable lack of visible female role models at the highest level. Now, how do we expand our engagement at every level? And I believe a multifaceted approach is essential. And we need to start with entry level, early education, and STEM promotion. So we must invest in STEM education from an early age, specifically targeting our girls. Now, this builds a strong pipeline of talent, igniting their interest in energy and climate field. Then we have to look at capacity building and skills development. So we need to provide targeted training and upskilling programs for women. Then we talk about mentorship program, and this is crucial to establish formal and informal mentorship initiatives. And these programs will connect aspiring women leaders with experienced professionals who can guide their careers, advocate for their advancements, and open doors to new opportunities. Now let's talk policy and regulatory framework. We must advocate for and implement gender responsive policies that promote equal opportunity. And another important aspect is access to finance and resources. We need to create mechanisms that actively facilitate women's access to funding for energy projects, entrepreneurship, and research. And finally, recognition. So we must actively promote and celebrate the achievement of women in sustainable energy sector through awards, media coverage, and conferences like this one. We can increase our visibility, inspire others, and truly dismantle the outdated stereotypes. So I believe by addressing these areas, we can collectively unlock the full potential of women's leadership and participation. And this isn't just about fairness, it's about accelerating our transition to a more equitable and sustainable energy future for all of us in the Caribbean and the Global South. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steffi.
Yeah.
I would love to bring in Dr. Teresa, but before I do that, I'd like to invite our audience, make sure you're dropping in your questions. There's been some brilliant reflections already on the panelists, but you're also part of this conversation. So any questions, comments you have, please drop them in the chat. So Dr. Teresa, I'd love to find out more about your work at the Jamaica Environment Trust. how are you using environmental education to build climate literacy and awareness among women and girls?
All right. Okay, thanks for that question. So I'll start off by just briefly telling you that, a little bit about JETS for those who have never heard of us. The Jamaica Environment Trust is a not-for-profit um, environmental organization that works to protect Jamaica's natural resources. It's a huge mission, huge mandate. We've been doing this since 1991, and we do it through three things: education, advocacy, and the law, and conservation. And the whole idea is that we have this goal of influencing individual behavior, public policy, and really how institutions operate. And environmental education has really been one of our strongest tools. And we believe it helps people to understand the issues and to feel more empowered to take action. So while our programs are not designed exclusively for young girls and women, they consistently make up the majority of the participants in our sessions and workshops. And that speaks to their leadership, their curiosity, and their potential as powerful agents of change. And again, through our conservation work, our work in law and advocacy, and education and awareness, we build climate and environmental literacy. We foster critical thinking, and we support people, especially young women and girls, to turn that knowledge into action. And we've seen that when you have young women that are given the tools and the space to lead, they show up with the passion and the creativity and a strong sense of responsibility, not just for the environment, but for their communities and future generations. I mean, we've worked with some women who, after we finish with a workshop, they're sending us ideas for proposals, and they want to put this into place in their communities. And they're really, that knowledge, a lot of times they say they didn't know. And they know, because of that natural instinct to lead, they really work with their communities to help build their resilience. So by prioritizing education, we believe that, or rather, it's not just a belief, we're not just raising awareness, we're building the confidence and the skills for women and girls to speak up, to take action, and to lead in their communities.
Thank you so much, Dr. Teresa. Jacinta, there was a lot of, it's sunrise where I am, so the light is coming in so strongly. Jacinta, we know that Indigenous women are leaders and caretakers and stewards of our land and our living ecosystems all around the world. I'd love to hear from you some of the ways that Indigenous women are preserving their own cultural practices whilst also innovating for climate resilience.
Thank you for that question. And Indigenous women continue to play a vital role in preserving cultural traditions. And one of the main thing that they continue to do is that they are known as the primary custodians of the traditional knowledge holders. And they play key role in keeping the local ecosystem, the weather patterns. They know about the medicinal plants, the sustainable agricultural practices, and the resource management. They continue to hold that knowledge and passing it on to the future generation orally, or teaching the younger generation what can be done, how to read the signs of the rain coming, how to look at the moon, how they look at the stars and say that rain is going to fall today, rain is not going to fall. And by just looking at nature, Indigenous women can actually tell what is going to happen. They also have the oral traditions, storytelling, and practical demonstration to younger generations. And Many cultural traditions often evolve around sustainable practices and that ensure that natural resources, indigenous women continue to practice traditional farming. They use a shift cultivation with the long fallow periods. They have sustainable fishing and responsible harvesting of forest products. And maintaining the core principle of their knowledge, their traditional knowledge, they adapt to traditional farming methods to cope with the unpredictable rainfall, the dry season, and the increased temperature. So they might evolve experimenting with, let's say, for example, crops that can stay longer without water and can lead them through with the dry season, or they can also use crops for during the rainy season. So women, indigenous women, continue to play a key role in that. Their knowledge help them to not to help them to with the food security. Yes, help them with food security. And oftentimes they face climate-induced resource scarcity or the changes in traditional livelihoods. For indigenous women are innovating by developing new income generating activities that are climate resilient. And this include ecotourism. They can have sustainable harvesting of forest products, and they also have development of value added products. They make crafts, they sell the crafts while becoming more resilient to climate change. They, well, indigenous women increasingly engage with knowledge exchange forums or platforms where both communities share successful adaptations with the youths, and empowering youths on these traditional knowledge also to help them to become climate resilient. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Jacinta. You've given some really brilliant examples of what building resilience looks like, especially when we're dealing with the slower onset impacts of climate change, which really complements Kendria's brilliant presentation, which is looking at what resilience means in the context of emergencies and disasters like Hurricane Dorian. So thank you so much for those really insightful examples and reminding us that we have culture. Culture is coded wisdom, and it really plays a strong role in how we're able to adapt and respond to climate change. I would like to bring in Renee and specifically hearing from you how you see legal frameworks supporting or limiting gender and climate justice in Caribbean communities.
Thank you so much, Marian, for that question. Now, one of the things we can observe is that traditional legal and policy frameworks are not necessarily progressive as it relates to inclusive decision making. And so that's essentially why we have frameworks and different guidelines in place in more recent times, such as the Samoa pathway, that has really set out certain guidelines in place as it relates to identifying, some of the disproportionate effects of women and girls as it relates to climate change, and more specifically as it relates to inclusive decision making. So some of the recommendations within the pathway would be, recognizing that there are disproportionate effects on women and girls, particularly in small island developing states. And so, of course, gender equality has to be mainstreamed into climate action. We also have, calls being made for women's full participation in decision making, mobilizing international financing, particularly for where climate finance is concerned for women-led initiatives, and of course, strengthening institutional capacity for gender-sensitive planning. Now, a report, that came out from Canary in 2021 really looked at how Caribbean civil society organizations are able to participate in climate finance and decision making, and it emphasized the need for inclusive and participatory governance mechanisms in climate action. Um, However, if we look at um, what is happening on the ground in different Caribbean countries, there are no shortage of guidelines in place, there are no shortage of policies in place, but the implementation is where we tend to see a lot of shortcomings. For example, Jamaica has a very progressive climate change policy framework, recognizing that there is linkages between poverty, gender, and climate vulnerability, and it commits, to mainstreaming gender and social considerations into the adaptation strategies. They also highlighted, of course, Vision 2030 in terms of what Jamaica's long-term development plan is. But sometimes when you look at how it plays out on the ground, there is a lack of implementation being seen. There is a lot of work being done, but practically speaking, in many instances, we tend to see a shortage of implementation. We could look at St. Lucia as well, very progressive national adaptation plan that they have in place in terms of integrating gender equality and targeting women's leadership in building climate resilience, ensuring that, we take into account gendered vulnerabilities, but to what extent are we seeing this actually playing out? And so because there is an absence of binding provisions to ensure that these things that are put in these policies are actually implemented, and we tend to see that issue quite a lot happening in international law. Who is going to hold these countries accountable, when they are part of different treaties and conventions, who is going to hold these countries accountable? And so you are seeing a lack of binding provisions in place to ensure that these mechanisms are actually set in stone and are being practiced on the local level. And of course, we see some colonial legal structures as well in many countries. When you look to see what is happening on the ground in terms of new issues happening, particularly where environmental sustainability is concerned, let's look, for example, at the issue of gendered violence after natural disasters. This is something that is being seen more and more common. However, have our laws developed to address the intersection of climate change, climate effects, and women's rights and safety? So while we have been seeing some progression happening, what we do see is a lack of implementation, a lack of binding mechanisms in place, a lack of modern legal structures to really support the new and emerging issues that climate change is presenting. So we definitely need to have more advocacy on the ground, more women included in legal spaces and policy spaces where they can actually advocate for that intersectional approach to be taken by Caribbean islands.
Thank you so much, Renee. You've raised some really powerful points. Great policies, great frameworks, but no implementation. The importance of accountability and how our legal systems and governance systems need to adapt and evolve to be able to really take into account the gendered impacts of climate change and climate resilience. Thank you so much for that. That's really some really great insights, and hopefully we can delve into that in the Q&A as well. Steffi, I would love to understand how you describe the relationship between energy and social inequalities and gender inequalities in the sector.
All right, so the relationship between energy, social or gender inequality is deeply intertwined. So even in a country like ours that's rich in energy resource, it's not just about who has access to electricity, but how that access or lack thereof shape our daily lives, opportunities, and even our safety. So here in Trinidad and Tobago, while most of us have access to grid electricity, the affordability of energy is a significant factor. For many women, especially those heading single parents household, and even those low income brackets, a substantial portion of the household budget goes towards electricity. Now, when energy cost rises, it often means sacrifices in other areas, like essential areas like food, education for children, and healthcare. So this directly impacts the well-being and the social mobility of families. with women often bearing the brunt of managing these financial strains. Now, beyond the household bill, there's a strong connection to unpaid work and time poverty. So while fuel wood collection may seem as a thing of the past, and there are still instances, particularly in more rural or informal settlements, where access to modern, efficient energy sources are limited. And this means more time being spent on domestic chores that could be eased by reliable and affordable energy. This would take away precious hours that could be used for education, income generating activities, or even rest and self care. So, the time poverty is a huge barrier for women's economic empowerment and overall well being. Then there's the issue of representation and economic opportunity within the energy sector itself. Now, historically, our energy sector, particularly oil and gas, has been very male dominated. Now, while we have seen progress and more women entering STEM fields and taking on leadership roles, there's still a significant imbalance. So this means that women voices and perspectives might not always be fully integrated into policy making, strategic planning, or the design of energy solutions. And when women are underrepresented in decision-making roles, it can lead to gender-blind energy policy that don't fully consider the diverse needs and impact on women and girls. And it also limits the economic opportunity for women in higher paying technical roles. So now the transition to cleaner energy is an opportunity that we cannot afford to miss for addressing these inequalities. So as we move towards renewables, there's a chance to intentionally design policies and programs that ensure women are at the forefront, not just as consumers, but as innovators, entrepreneurs, and leaders. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Steffi.
You're welcome.
Dr. Teresa, we just had a previous discussion around accountability. I would love to hear from you. What do you think we can do to make sure that women and vulnerable groups are not only participating in the way decisions are made about environmental policy and climate resilience, but also that we're able to hold authorities accountable? Accountability, I feel like, is a key to unlocking a lot of the solutions and impact that we're already seeing in the way that women are driving and enabling resilience across the region and the world.
So that's a really good question. So first of all, I want to start off by saying that meaningful participation isn't just a box to tick, right? And I think sometimes when you hear our different agencies says, "Oh, we had a consultation," it's really just a checkbox exercise, because you rarely ever see the comments and the feedback reflected. It's also taking place at really late, after decisions have already been made. And so this is why I want to use the word meaningful participation. It's not a checkbox exercise. It's about getting better outcomes, right? So what happens is that when women and other vulnerable groups are included in decisions about the environment, the results tend to be far better. They tend to be more fair, more effective, and more sustainable. And this is really because it brings together the lived experiences, and women tend to bring that intersectional lens to environmental issues. But as I mentioned earlier, that kind of participation, meaningful participation, doesn't just happen. We have to create a space for it, especially in communities that are already feeling the impacts of climate change. And too often women are seen as just victims. Women and vulnerable groups are just seen as victims of climate change. But that's really a very limited view. The truth is that we have women out there leading and doing the work. They're the ones that are managing A lot of the natural resources. They're leading community groups. They're finding ways to adapt. What is missing is that their voices aren't always reflected in the actual policies and the decisions that are being made. So, in order to change that, we need to do a couple things. One, we need to make sure that women are a part of the process early, that they're involved in the planning stages, the budgeting, the decisions about what actually gets implemented. Don't invite them to the table after you've kind of formulated a plan and you just want feedback. That's not meaningful participation. We have to invest in training, access to information, and opportunities for women to influence climate policy directly, women and other vulnerable groups. And we need to have strong legal protections so that when women and other environmental defenders speak out, they can do so safely and without fear. So this is where the Escazú Agreement comes in. For those of you who are not very familiar with it, it's a regional treaty that gives everyone the right to access environmental information, participate in decision making, environmental decision making, and to seek justice when those rights are violated. And it specifically provides protection mechanisms for environmental defenders. These are people who are working peacefully in different ways, shapes, or forms as individuals or as part of different groups, and many of whom are women, right? So it gives them some form of protection. And Jamaica has signed it, as have several other Caribbean countries, but we haven't ratified it, and that needs to change. So other countries such as Antigua and Barbuda and St. Lucia, they've ratified it and are now in implementation phase. So I believe that when participation is informed, supported, and protected, my apologies, it becomes more meaningful. And when women and vulnerable groups are truly included, invited to the space very early in the process on multiple occasions, seen as not just checkbox, we don't just get the better policies, but we also build stronger and more resilient communities for everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Teresa. You've raised some good points. Thank you for highlighting the Escazú Agreement, because I think that's such a powerful mechanism for strengthening accountability. And your point about being at the table from the start, not as checkboxes or to, review solutions that have been proposed is really, really important. Before I have a question for Jacinta coming up, but I'm seeing some really great engagement on our comments. So thank you so much. And we're coming up to our Q&A in a few minutes. So I'd love for you guys to make sure you keep adding your questions and reflections. We're learning so much and sharing examples as well across our different countries. So that's amazing and great to see. Jacinta, there was a question that came earlier about barriers, which I'll bring up again in our Q&A coming up. But I wanted to ask you specifically around Indigenous women. What barriers do they face when it comes to decision-making on climate policy, either at the local level or the international levels, and how can these be addressed to ensure more inclusive climate solutions?
Oh, and that's a really interesting question. So, well, Indigenous women continue to face several barriers in participating in climate decision making. And first, they have limited representation in formal governance structures. So while Indigenous communities do have their traditional governance systems, which is the village councils, which is led by what we call a tushao, or the village captain, sometimes these formal structures don't always reflect women's leadership. Well, that's especially in the national and international levels involving Indigenous women. And I think what we can do to address that barrier is that we can have if there are initiatives that empower Indigenous women to take on leadership roles within the village councils and other community level decision making bodies. You can also have promote trainings and capacity building programs specifically for Indigenous women on governance, advocacy, and even on climate change. And from where I am, I can speak about a women's group that have taken up that initiative to empower Indigenous women and girls in the Wapchan territory. We have the Wapchan Wish Women's Movement, WWM, which has taken up that opportunity to empower women and girls across the Wapchan territory. And we have seen an impact from that initiative where women take up the opportunity to contest in the elections for their village captains or for two shows in the two years, the two terms that they had elections. So women did accepted the position of competing to become a village leader. There is also limited access to training, formal education, or access to training on climate science, policy, advocacy within the Indigenous communities. And to have that addressed, I think we can develop information and educational materials in Indigenous communities and have these information through accessible formats. You can use the Indigenous language that the community speaks, or we can go into share handouts, have a translator with you if you're going to facilitate a workshop or a session with these people, have translators who can also translate to in the language to the people. There is also the lack of traditional knowledge in formal processes. So while Indigenous women are custodians of traditional knowledge about climate patterns, biodiversity, sustainable resource management, this knowledge is often not valued or integrated into mainstream climate policies. And how we can address that, if we look at Indigenous communities and more so Indigenous women, if there can be direct climate finance to Indigenous-led groups, organizations that can fund initiatives that these women would like to take up. And I'm sure women with that financial support can be able to make a change within the community, which can also benefit the country and the world as a whole. And next, another big barrier for women in general is the gender-based violence and discrimination. Well, Indigenous women will often face that. I would say three times. One, because they're being Indigenous. Two is because they're women. And that is one huge topic or huge barrier that Indigenous women face. So like everywhere else, we would know or we can relate to discrimination against women and girls or Indigenous women and girls. They can face discrimination in different forms, or they face discrimination in different forms, violence that further them and restrict their ability to participate freely and safely. Sometimes they might take up a role and then they be discriminated, which sometimes or most of the time affect the person's self-esteem and most likely decide, no, I cannot do this, or no, I shouldn't be doing this. And as Indigenous women, we need a society, we need an environment that would help Indigenous women and girls take up or listen to them so that we can help address these issues. We can implement programs to address gender-based violence and discrimination within Indigenous communities, and also advocate for women's rights, support education opportunities for Indigenous girls and women to enhance their participation in all levels. You can have them at the local level, regional level, international level, representing themselves, representing Indigenous women and girls. And we can also, to address those issues, to address the discrimination against women and girls, we can recognize and support the multiple roles Indigenous women play, including their care work and contributions to food security and even to climate justice. So by addressing those barriers, we can see or recognize the full potential of Indigenous women as powerful agents of change, climate change, and that can ensure that climate solutions are more effective and sustainable for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jacinta. You've touched on some really powerful issues and barriers, and specifically the point around gender-based violence. I think that's something that we need to talk a lot more about, and particularly with regard to climate justice and climate resilience. So thank you for sharing your insights. I really appreciate that. Steffi, I would love to hear from you a real world example that you have of how renewable energy systems have also contributed to economic opportunities, as well as climate resilience for a marginalized group.
Right. So I have a very wonderful example that I really excited to share. So in a rural area along Trinidad northern coast, there is a pioneering female-owned, female-managed eco-retreat. And this to me stands as a powerful example of how renewable energy drives both economic opportunity and climate resilience for an underrepresented group. So this area in particular, they face unreliable electricity grid. And this female owner invested in a solar power system with battery storage to power her 6-cottage eco-retreat. Now, this would ensure consistent power for guest comfort and operational efficiency. Now, this investment has transformed the local economy landscape, the local economic landscape, particularly for women through direct employment and empowerment. So the retreat provides significant direct jobs for local women in hospitality, management, nature guides, fostering female leadership and stable income in a region with limited formal employment. So this has also stimulated a local economy. So this retreat sources their fresh produce, seafood, and authentic craft from local farmers and fisher folk, many of which are women. So, and this creates new markets and income streams within this community. Then we have the reduced operational costs. So by generating their own electricity, the retreat drastically cut energy expenses, and this allowed savings to be reinvested into the business expansion, staff training, and marketing. And then we have enhanced tourism appeal. And this retreat, the retreat's commitment in itself to sustainability attracts environmentally conscious travelers. And this leads to higher occupancy, and it also boosts the local tourism economy. Now, its contribution to climate resilience. We have reduced carbon footprint. So replacing the grid electricity with solar power significantly cut greenhouse gas emission, directly aiding in climate change mitigation. And then we have enhanced energy security. So the battery storage system ensures there is an uninterrupted power, even during frequent grid outage caused by severe weather, making the retreat exceptionally resilient to climate-related disruptions. And then, of course, we have the demonstration effect. So this eco-retreat success serves as a tangible example, encouraging other local businesses and homeowners in this rural area to adopt clean energy, fostering a more climate resilient regional economy. So this retreat, it stands to me as a beacon of sustainable development, and through the strategic adoption of renewable energy and female leadership, it has not only secured its own future, but it has uplifted its community by creating a vital economic opportunity and boosting its defense against escalating challenges of climate change.
Thank you so much, Steffi, for sharing that brilliant example about the retreat. I wonder if there's is there something online that we can access, because I would also love to read up on the example after the conference today. Okay, Steffi. All right, please. If there is there is.
Yes, I'll share. Yes.
Okay. All right. Please do. Please do. I really, yes, brilliant. Thank you so much. Dr. Teresa, we've spoken about the need for strengthening women's not just leadership but voice in discussions and decision making around climate resilience. But we also know that women are incredibly powerful advocates in the climate justice space, and they're often the ones enabling accountability and ensuring that leaders and people in political power are truly keeping true to their promises. But I'd love to hear from you also, how are women driving environmental advocacy and influencing policy in ways that advance climate justice?
Thanks for that question. Okay, so I want to start off, by saying that I really think it's fair to say that women have been at the heart of the environmental movement globally for generations. And I think this is the same for Jamaica. Whether it's through community organizing, the legal action, the formal advocacy, or education, we see that women have been consistently leading the charge to protect. And I'm going to speak from the Jamaican perspective primarily, but I think it's fair to say that this is probably right across the Caribbean, that women are the ones that have been consistently leading the charge to protect Jamaica's natural resources and to really push back against environmental injustice. A lot of the environmental NGOs that we have here in Jamaica, for example, were formed by women and continue to be led by women. JET, for example, was founded by a woman and continues to be led by a woman. Most of our staff are women. Most of our volunteers and our community partners are women. It seems that we're the ones that are most concerned with the state of the rivers and beaches, mobilizing cleanups, showing up at the town hall meetings, raising the alarm when development or pollution threatens their communities. And women's advocacy is really rooted in the lived experiences of climate impacts, of food and water insecurity, of watching their communities become more vulnerable. And I think it's also shaped, and I mentioned this earlier, that it's shaped by our natural instinct to nurture and protect not just the environment, but the people who depend on it, and especially future generations. I do a lot of what I do because I'm thinking about my kids, and I'm thinking about what it is that I'm leaving behind for them. And if I don't do it, who will? So I take on that. I think it's important. And a lot of women take on that role. We tend to bring that intersectional lens to environmental issues. So it's an environmental issue, but it's a public health issue. It's a social justice issue. It's an economic inequality issue. And that perspective, I think, pushes advocacy efforts and policy way beyond the technical fixes, way beyond those technical issues, and toward a more people-centered, justice-driven solutions. So when women leaders continue to drive environment and climate justice, when women leaders continue to drive environment and climate justice, not just for women, but for entire communities. And I think that's very important to note.
Thank you so much, Dr. Teresa. You've really raised some really powerful points, and we have some comments also in the chat from Liz. Women have been at the heart of the climate movement, and that is very, very true. I have one final question for everyone involved in the panel. Thank you so much. You've been brilliant. Before we open up for our Q&A, there's been some great questions coming up on the Q&A, and I'm so keen to also hear your insights and perspectives from our panelists. So my final question to all of you, what gives you hope about the next generation of Caribbean women leaders, and what support do they still urgently need? So I will start off with Renee.
Thank you so much, Marion. I mean, being in this conference is so inspiring. You know, I am looking at the chat and I feel very hopeful of what the future has to offer for the Caribbean region. In terms of hope, you know, there is a certain level of boldness that comes with women who are in the Caribbean region leading in their own spaces. We see that women are no longer waiting to be invited into spaces. They are creating their own tables. And I know that the keynote speaker spoke about, you know, in terms of in the aftermath of the hurricane, women were creating their own initiatives. They were not waiting to see, well, what can the government do? What can be done? How could I become part of something? But they are literally creating the spaces. And so the boldness in their voice and in their vision for creating strategies to helping us achieve a certain level of sustainability within the Caribbean is quite remarkable. What we are also seeing, I think, which provides me with a sense of hope, is more intersectionality in the activism among both young people as well as the women who are in leadership positions. And we're seeing it right in the chat here today in terms of women who occupy these leadership positions, now seeing that there is a need for us to not just look at climate as an issue in silos, but an issue that touches and concerns so many other different factors within our society. Things such as, of course, gender, mental health, race, reproductive systems and justice. So we are seeing much more intersectionality taking place. Of course, however, there is a need for that to be done on a much larger scale. And of course, we are seeing much more digital activism taking place, which provides us with a lot of hope because it provides us with the platform to be able to connect beyond boundaries and beyond borders, which provides us with a greater level of impact happening. What do we need? Finance. We need finance, access to finance, particularly. A lot of the times we see, climate finance, it's not very it doesn't really cater much for, in terms of youth-led women-led initiatives on a smaller scale. So we would definitely want to see much more access to climate finance with these types of initiatives, as well as, particularly for me, I would like to see much more policy literacy and legal literacy for women who are in, grassroots organizations and doing the work on the ground, so that they know that it's more than just programmatic work, but how can we actually shift policies? How can we shift laws that will really cater for women and girls, and of course adopting a more gender mainstreaming approach to the work that we do within the region. So that's my contribution.
Thank you so much, Renee. Steffi, I'd love to hear from you.
Oh, hi again. Right, so this conference gives me so much hope. And to see all these female-led organizations coming together, shout out to the Climate Conscious podcast and Global Yaadie. This has just given me so much hope. And moving forward, I believe we need continued collaboration. We need to build strong networks, and we need to advocate for women even more. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, I agree to collaboration, coming together, learning from each other. Mentorship happens in many ways across regions, across generations. And I see this conference being a form of mentorship, because it's a space for us to really learn from each other as peers and collaborators in the space. Jacinta, I'd love to hear from you. Yes, and we need the funds. Sorry, I'm tracking the comments chat as well. We need the funds. Jacinta, I'd love to hear from you. What gives you hope, and what support do Caribbean women leaders need?
Okay, well, being part of this conference or this initiative, or I getting this, receiving this opportunity to be part of it, is already a step. However, I think if there are other things, conferences, forums, I think we should have more participation, involve Indigenous women and girls to be part of conferences, or have them involved in things so that they can build their confidence, they can learn and empower themselves. And networking is one important thing. How can we have women led initiatives or women led organizations network with other international or national uh, bodies? How can we have them? We need to bridge the gap between the indigenous people, women led organizations with those on the national or regional level. And of course, finance. How can we support indigenous women? They may have the ideas, they may want to implement something, but there is no finance. How can we make finance accessible to indigenous led organizations? And yes, we need to advocate more for women. Women advocating for women would also encourage the younger women or younger girls growing up see that other women are advocating for women, for the rights of women. You will see a new generation of women being stronger and continue that advocacy to have their voices heard.
Thank you so much, Jacinta. I'm hearing a recurring comment about funding and the need for funding. And this is definitely something that, yeah, we can do a deeper dive on in terms of examples that we've seen where funding actually reaches our initiatives and helps us to build climate resilience in our communities and across the region. Dr. Teresa, last but definitely not least in any means.
Can I say ditto? I think what gives me hope, I agree with everything everybody has said, because I think it's so true. We need all of those things. And there's a lot of hope. There's a lot to look forward to. But what gives me hope about the next generation of Caribbean women leaders, is their courage and clarity. There's so many that are boldly confronting injustice. They're challenging outdated systems, and they're really carving out their space in areas where their voices were once silenced or once sidelined, and they're not waiting to be invited to the table. They're building new tables. We see so many examples of different organizations built by young women because they saw the need, and they are grounded in community and sustainability. And many are unafraid to name the climate crisis, call out the gender-based violence, or hold power to account. Their activism is intersectional. It is informed and deeply rooted in love for people and place. But they need support, as do we all. But there is that urgency for that and sustained need for support. Because again, too often we see where leaders tend to work in silos. Sometimes they're underfunded or overextended. We need safe spaces, both physical and digital, for dialogue, for healing, for collaboration. We need mentorship. There needs to be mentorship. We spoke about funding and the decision-making power in policies that affect their lives. And critically, we need to dismantle those structural barriers that limit their full participation, whether it be legal, cultural, or economic.
Thank you so much, Dr. Teresa. I really, really appreciate that. So it's now time for our Q&A section, and we've had some really great questions come through, which I think will open up room for a dynamic conversation to continue. The first question that we have is from Paula, and I think you've all touched on this in different ways throughout our conversation, but in your responses. But Paula asked, what barriers still stand in the way of women accessing the resources they need, be it land, funding, or technical tools that they need to drive climate solutions? Maybe if you can all give like one, because I think we've touched on it a few times, but if you can give maybe one key thing that you feel like is really like the biggest barrier in the work that you do.
Hi, Marion. So I think that what we tend to see is a lack of gender mainstreaming, because what we tend to find is that there are resources available there. However, there is a flat playing field, I should say, for everyone to be able to access these resources. And so the systems that acknowledge and appreciate that women and girls are disproportionately affected by climate events, by climate change, not acknowledging that they really are the ones who need to be able to access these resources. So there being a certain level of equity in terms of accessing resources, I think is lacking. So we definitely need to, I think, one of our panelists tonight, I can't remember which one was saying, is to dismantle the barriers that exist and to really push and advance for there being gender mainstreaming, and of course, recognizing and appreciating that there cannot be one playing field for all, but there must be equity in these discussions, in these resources, in people being able to access these resources.
Thank you so much. Anybody else want to add?
So I think that for women, a lot of women in rural areas who want to get financing lack the technical know-how. And so this is where capacity building would come in. An example like grant writing workshop. And as I say that, tomorrow we have the grant writing workshop session. So I believe that technical know-how, that's one of the key barriers.
Thank you so much, Steffi. And I think sometimes we, in our collectives, we have the technical knowledge, but we haven't been able to come together and share. So I feel like things like the grant writing workshop, for example, tomorrow is such a brilliant initiative, right? Because it's allowing us to collectively share the different knowledge and skills that we have amongst us. So thank you, Steffi, for that. Jacinta, Dr. Teresa, you want to add?
I think that one of the barriers is that we're not always invited to the table to have those discussions. And so this is one of the things we've been talking about, improving public participation. And so that is, just thanks for putting back that question in the chat. Definitely funding, and you need to have the capacity building, but it also, again, if you don't have the information, so again, access to information is one of those things that encourage participation. So that's one of the things that I would say is a barrier.
Thank you so much, Dr. Teresa.
Well, I think, coming from an indigenous community, how often do we know or learn of these initiatives? Well, there are initiatives. How many times have indigenous women be part of this or included in these initiatives? Well, others, those who are more in the urban area, women in the urban area may have those opportunity. Unfortunately, not all indigenous women or indigenous women in general would have access to those. And having their participation or including them, we can build that bridge that gap between other women who have the initiative and the indigenous women. And technical support, how do we know there are grants or how do we know there are things happening to have women involved? And again, it comes to bridging the gap between indigenous women and other organizations or other women who have access or have the opportunity to be on board on different forums or different activities, events.
Thank you so much, Jacinta. And thank you for also highlighting that even in a cohort as women, there are different groups that are, have less access to resources or support or opportunities for participation, like Indigenous women, like women who live in rural areas as well. So, yeah, I really appreciate you naming that as well. Our next question is from Vidyarata. Thank you so much for putting this question. It's very, very interesting and very important to discuss as well, right? So the question is, what experiences have you had with engaging men or males in recognizing the inequalities and the need for inclusive approaches and having gendered perspectives in these conversations around climate resilience? And Vijayartha has put a example or suggested to carry man and to carry flags as well to deepen engagement and learning. So yeah, the question is experiences of engaging men and males in conversations around inclusive approaches and gendered perspectives on climate resilience.
I guess I could start. I've had some interesting experiences when we talk about things like gender, and even just widening it a little bit to like even NGOs who are largely led by women here. I remember having a conversation after I saw where there was a technical discussion about climate change, and I raised concerns with the government entity and the heads of the entities, and I was like, I don't understand why we weren't invited to this kind of discussion. And the comment to me was, it's a little too technical, and I don't think you could manage this kind of discussion. And I was very offended, and ended up having to explain how much more technical many of the NGOs and CSOs are more. So in often cases, they're much more technical and have greater capacity than those who are in the government entities themselves. I think that there are other examples, but what it comes down to is that there's this lack of understanding, and even just choosing not to understand and choosing not to care. I have found, and I am broadly generalizing that because it wouldn't be fair to apply this to every male either, but this is just some of my experiences.
All right. So, well, speaking from a Trinidadian perspective, we as a society in Trinidad and Tobago has progressed so much that our male counterparts are welcoming us. And this is how I have been feeling. I've been feeling so welcome. And there is not much, how to say it, biasness in terms of judging how much we know or how much they think we know. So for me, the males are actually welcoming our leadership as women. They actually look for our input into a lot of the decision making.
If I could contribute right after, I've had experiences on both sides of the spectrum. I've had men question as to why so much resources continuously have to be put into women's work, what is being done for men. That's a comment I get usually every time I go to speak about gender equality. I remember I went abroad for a conference. We were training parliamentarians on incorporating the perspectives of young women into their decision making. And a male parliamentarian from one of the islands, one of the Caribbean islands, said to me, he said, why is so much resources being pumped into the work of young women? Why is so much resources being pumped into investing in young women when it's very clear that women are performing better in schools. Girls are performing better in schools, at the tertiary level, at the primary level. The research is clear. However, many times, and I think Deval put the comment in the chat, we are seeing girls performing better than boys in the education system, but it's not being translated into leadership roles. It's not being translated into actual leadership in society. And so you still have that very patriarchal mindset pervading many aspects of society. However, what I try to do, at least in the work that I do with my nonprofit organization, is I try to incorporate men as often as possible. I think sometimes it's very easy for us to forget that gender equality requires cooperation from men. It requires them to be educated on it. It requires their contributions. It requires them to see things from a different perspective sometimes. So many times I have events or programs for young women. I invite young men into the room as well. I actually did a program early on this year in February where I invited both young men and young women into one space, and I educated young men on what gender equality meant, what it looked like practically, and you realize very early on that many of our young men within the region are being socialized to see women a certain way, as being as belonging not in leadership spaces, and so I think that we ought to be, as open as we can as well to educating them on what gender equality looks like, particularly where climate action is concerned, and the value that we are able to contribute to discussions, to decision making, etc. And I think that once we are able to continue doing that and see them as allies and see them as collaborators, we would be able to move the conversation forward.
Well, on that part, as I mentioned before, that we have a local women's group or organization that we call the Watch and Weege Women's Movement. And when we started meeting with women across the territory, the Wapchan territory, the men they looked out, and after sitting in these sessions, their feedback was positive. Well, you would find some males who tend to understand what you're trying to seek for women, and there are other men who won't see it that way. So there are two groups that we'd have to focus on. Well, despite the gathering was specifically for women and girls, there were a few men that decided to accompany their wives to these sessions and gave a feedback at the end of the session saying that they never knew of this, and it is important that now their wives are being educated about women's rights and how they can minimize domestic violence. And these men were well spoken and said that they were willing to support their wives, willing to look at society and the environment from a different perspective.
Thanks, Jacinta. And on that topic of, gender equity, I think that we can acknowledge that we have made progress, but there's still far to go. And we have to take the men along with us. They are our allies. and they often hold positions of power. So Israeli has to be collaborative. And I want to give a shout out to the men that have joined us on the CW4CJ journey. I see Vidya was very active in the chat, and Vidya was a former speaker at CW4CJ 2023. So we have come to the end of another exciting session. Our speakers shared such great insights, and something that resonates with me. I believe it was Rennie and also Dr. Teresa that spoke about bold and courageous women, and also having clarity. And definitely, women are on the forefront leading resilience. And again, we need to continue to support each other. We need to continue lobbying for greater access to resources and using these fora to share our knowledge, our expertise. My hope is that these 2 days of dialogue would translate into action, translate into greater collaboration, translate into greater access to the funds that we spoke about in the chat, because we need resources to make an even greater impact. Look at what women are doing without sufficient resources. So imagine what can be done when they indeed are given access to finance, technical capacity, and just general support. So I want to thank everyone who showed up, thank our speakers, our donor, our sponsors, our community co-sponsors, our technical support staff as well for such an amazing 2 days of dialogue. Thank you to our moderators, Doreen yesterday and Marion today, our live case studies from day one, our keynotes from day two, Kendria Ferguson. You gave us so much food for thought and so much policy recommendations that we really hope can be implemented. And thank you to our wonderful panel for bringing such diverse perspectives around the issue of leadership, equity, and climate solutions. And yes, thank you to the Global Yaadie, my co-convener, co-organizer. Any final words before we close, Dana Lynn?
Just to say that I'm really grateful for all that has unfolded. Let me just echo the energy in the chat, the sentiments already expressed, and to just give my personal thanks to each of our speakers for making CW4CJ 2025 a success. I know we have one day to go, but certainly we're grateful for the kind of impactful discussions that have rolled across the rooms, the virtual rooms, across the different platforms, and really so grateful for all that has been underscored. A positively triggering thing or that was mentioned from the keynote and the panel discussion about strong women. Sometimes while it's a good adjective in a lot of cases, but sometimes it can be overused to overlook some of the ways in which we need support. But certainly, I continue to be encouraged by all that is on display.
Yes, indeed. Um, we don't necessarily want to be strong all the time, but we definitely need to be safe. So I must take the opportunity again to sincerely thank the Clara Lionel Foundation for their generous support, making CW4CJ 2025 possible, as well as Girls Care for their support, and our vibrant network of community co-sponsors.
Yeah.
So don't forget, join us tomorrow for our workshop, our grant writing workshop, hosted by Ms. Karen Phillip of Kainos Consulting. If you don't have the link, subscribe to our mailing list and we'll be sure to send out that link so you have the opportunity to join us. It's free of charge tomorrow at 10:30 a.m. AST.
All right. Show me the money. I know a lot of people are excited for that panel, so I'm hoping to see a very full. We're hoping to see a very full room tomorrow to build capacity so that we can attract funding for greater impact.
Yes. So thanks everyone and have a good night.